Welcome to Labor Watch. I'm Elliot Keegan. In this episode, I'm going to wrap up some of the bigger stories from 2021 and talk about what's in store for 2022. There were a few headline-featured strikes and organizing campaigns in 2021, and a historic one that might have flown under the radar. Starbucks workers organized for the first time in the U.S., workers at HelloFresh and Amazon voted down the union, and nurses in Massachusetts held the longest strike in state history. And 2021 was a big year for unions, not just because of strikes and some of these campaigns, but also because of the growing positive public sentiment towards unions. A recent Gallup poll found that positive opinions towards unions are the highest they've been since 1965, with about 68% of the public saying they support labor unions. Big campaigns like the ones at Amazon and Starbucks helped put unions back in the headlines, while the COVID pandemic and recession made people realize how essential some of these underpaid and often underappreciated workers really are. Over the last 30 years, union membership has been on the decline, but in 2021 there was a slight uptick. It's hard to say at this point, though, if this was a temporary aberration or the start of a new trend. So I'll start off by following up with my last video about Kellogg, the Kellogg strike. That ended December 21st when workers agreed to a new contract after about 2.5 months out on strike. Initially, workers were striking over the issue of a two-tier wage system. It's a system that put new workers on a lower pay scale than more senior employees, like a permanently lower pay scale. And this issue with the Kellogg strike was part of a larger trend to try to end these two-tier pay scales across a lot of union contracts. The John Deere strike, which ended just a few weeks before the Kellogg strike, was also centered around this two-tier pay scale, as well as the Volvo strike, which happened earlier in the summer of 2021. Both the John Deere and Volvo strikes ended with the elimination of the two-tier pay scale in their contracts. At Kellogg, workers agreed to a 5-year contract that would set a path to the elimination of the two-tier system, but it wasn't going to get rid of it altogether, at least not immediately. It would take any employee that had at least 4 years on the job and move them up to the higher pay scale, and it would create a system where the pay scale could be removed over time for the rest of the employees. And baristas in Buffalo became the first Starbucks employees to unionize at a corporate-operated location in the U.S. 3 different Starbucks locations in Buffalo held elections in December. One of them voted down, one of them voted yes for the union, and the other one was originally challenged, but the National Labor Relations Board just ruled earlier this week in favor of the union in recognition of them. So that's 2 locations in Buffalo that now have union representation. So these workers still need to negotiate their first contract, which can sometimes be a rocky process, but they're already flexing their collective action muscle. On January 5th, workers at that first Buffalo location that organized walked out citing health concerns related to COVID. They're demanding that the company provide N95 masks, access to COVID testing, and they want to be able to enforce a mask mandate for their customers. And Unite Here tried to organize HelloFresh warehouse workers in California and Colorado, but both campaigns failed. Over 60% of workers at the meal kit delivery service voted against the union at 2 separate elections, held in Aurora, Colorado and Richmond, California. But Unite Here has filed unfair labor practice charges, claiming workers were threatened, intimidated, and retaliated against for supporting the union. So those charges could lead to a second election, as they have with the next topic. Amazon. Amazon workers in Alabama held the highest profile union campaign in years, maybe decades. Amazon is the second largest employer in the United States with nearly 1 million employees, just behind Walmart, but is completely non-union. Workers at the Bessemer, Alabama warehouse held elections by mail amid the heightened pandemic concerns in April. The vote came down almost 2-1 against the union, but the NLRB recently ruled that unfair labor practices committed by the company were serious enough to warrant a second election. So there's going to be a new election at that Alabama location. Workers are going to start receiving ballots in early February, and it's going to be another vote-by-mail election. They're going to start counting the ballots March 28th. And student workers at Columbia University are still out on strike, but it escalated this winter as the university threatened to replace all these striking workers in the spring. The university sent out a letter in early December saying that there wouldn't be any positions available in the spring for any of the striking student workers. But just to be clear, the United Auto Workers who are representing these students, they filed unfair labor practices earlier this year. So these strikers are ULP strikers, or unfair labor practice strikers, and you're not allowed to replace ULP strikers. So as opposed to the Kellogg strike that happened earlier, Kellogg's was threatening to replace those workers, to permanently replace them. But those workers were striking for like wages and benefits, and there's a distinction made in the law where companies are allowed to permanently replace workers who are striking for wages, but you can't replace people who are striking because of unfair labor practices. So these student workers at Columbia joined a union over a year ago, but they still don't have a contract yet. The United Auto Workers and Columbia came to a tentative agreement back in April of last year, but it was rejected by about a 5% margin, and workers have been striking since then. In Worcester, Massachusetts, nurses at St. Vincent's Hospital spent over 300 days on strike before agreeing to a contract on January 3rd. That's the longest strike in Massachusetts state history. Over 90% of nurses voted in favor of ratifying the new contract, which includes staffing improvements, which was one of the most contentious issues during contract negotiations. The nurses have been saying that they're understaffed, that they sometimes have 6 or 7 maybe patients per nurse, and that it's unsafe for the patient. So the new contract the nurses agreed to will increase staffing levels and put caps on patients in the units. Meanwhile, 1,100 coal miners in Alabama are still out on strike and are approaching the 300-day mark themselves. The strike began back on April 1st when United Mine Workers of America, which represent the miners, and the mine owner Warrior Met Coal couldn't come to an agreement on a new contract. The last time these workers negotiated with this company, it was when the company was coming out of bankruptcy and the mine wasn't doing very well. So the workers gave up a lot of concessions in wages and benefits to try to help the company and the mine become solvent. Now that the mine's operating at a profit, when they came to the negotiating table, workers wanted back what they gave up. But according to the workers, the company wasn't even offering them what they had before. Meanwhile, the company recorded a net profit of $38 million in the third quarter of last year. And that was despite the costs of the strike, because they made that profit while the workers were on strike. And Warrior Met reported $6.8 million in costs related to the strike, and that's not including the $9 million they say they lost because of reduced operations. And in some brighter news, student researchers at the University of California won the largest organizing campaign of the year. 17,000 student researchers across the UC system now form Student Researchers United, UAW. Students from every UC campus in the system submitted a supermajority of over 10,000 signed cards to the California Public Employees Relations Board back in May. But at first, the university challenged the validity of those signed cards and refused to acknowledge them. So in mid-December, this newly formed union had a strike authorization vote, and about 98% voted in favor of going on strike. And just shortly after that, the UC system agreed to recognize the union. And you might remember earlier when I was talking about Columbia and mentioning that they were also part of the United Auto Workers, and these student researchers at the UC are also now members of the United Auto Workers. And this is part of a big push that UAW is doing to organize more white-collar workers, but specifically academic employees. About 100,000 university employees are now UAW members, which makes up about a quarter of all UAW membership. Looking forward, over 1 million union members have contracts expiring this year, and a series of high-profile campaigns and strikes on the back of the COVID recession could lead to a wave of organizing efforts and labor actions. So there's a lot of momentum going into 2022. And the timing couldn't be better for unions. There are about 200 large contracts, those covering 1,000 or more workers, that are set to expire before the end of 2022. And there are hundreds of thousands of union workers under, hundreds of smaller contracts that will also be expiring this year. So here are just a few of the bigger ones. There are 195,000 food and beverage workers that have contracts expiring this year. A coalition of United Food and Commercial Worker locals in California, Washington, and Colorado are coordinating their actions and their demands. These locals represent about 100,000 grocery workers. And just recently, some of those workers who are part of that coalition in Colorado went out on strike at their jobs at King Soopers. And they filed unfair labor charges against King Soopers, so this is one of the first new strikes of this year. Longshore workers at 29 ports along the West Coast rejected an offer to extend a contract that they have expiring this July. These are members of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and the last time they negotiated their contract back in 2014, it led to a 9-month slowdown at the docks. In 2019, that contract was extended with some wage increases, and the Pacific Maritime Association, which is just a collective of a lot of the shipping companies that operate on those docks. They wanted to extend it again, but the union just rejected that offer. They want to negotiate. They want to have negotiations for a whole new contract. There are also over 250,000 union employees in K-12 education with upcoming expiring contracts. The country's largest K-12 educators contract, which covers 120,000 teachers and school staff in New York, is set to expire in September. The contract's also expiring for 4,000 Teamster car haulers. So these are the people that ship new cars from the factories to the dealerships. So right now there's already been a backlog on new cars because of the just global chip shortage, which is a shortage of microprocessors and semiconductors. These chips go in every new car, but there's been a shortage of them around the world. So there's already a shortage of cars, already a delay in cars being shipped out. And now these people who drive these cars from the factories to the dealerships, they've got a contract that's expiring at the end of May. So if negotiations between now and then don't go smoothly, that could lead to even more disruption in the auto industry. And the United Steelworkers have begun negotiations with Marathon Petroleum on a new contract that could affect 30,000 workers nationwide. Marathon is currently the top U.S. refiner, so they're representing a bunch of other refiners and petrochemical companies in these negotiations. So the current contract for these workers will expire February 1st, and even whatever agreement that's reached between the steelworkers and Marathon still has to go out to all the locals for them to ratify it. The contract has already expired for 29,000 members of the California Faculty Association, which represents faculty, librarians, and counselors at the California State University system. There are also thousands of hospital workers and telecom workers and other workers in higher education that have contracts that will be expiring this year. So stay tuned for those stories. We'll be covering them here on Labor Watch, and thanks for watching.